So by the thumbnail, you must have understood it's a project about NASA API. But let's understand what's exactly an API first. API stands for Application Programming Interface. This is the way two software components can communicate with each other with a set of rules defined between them. So the entity which is going to provide the API, it defines certain functions, certain rules, certain sets of standard for communication, the data it wants to share, the function it wants to share. So that it defines as a standard. And the entity which wants to consume that API, that is the entity which wants to use that API, has to follow those rules. They can utilize those rules, write their code accordingly, and so that's the way you can utilize the data which is offered by the entity which is exposing the API. So there are benefits on the both sides when it comes to using API. APIs can be considered as the flexible aspect of sharing data. They are pretty easy to manage. They have a simplified set of design. So for example, consider a scenario where you have a lot of data and you want to share that data through some means. What you can do here is you have your database system. You can develop an API sitting in front of it, and the entities which are like mobile applications, web applications, even IoT devices, they can communicate with the API, and the API in turn communicates with your database. The backend server pulls out the data and then provides it to the entities which are requesting it. So there are some pretty interesting examples you can use, you can try out when it comes to API. SpaceX offers their API, their information. You have API for open weather as well. You can get the weather data for a lot of countries through that API. You also have API for Pokemon. You make a request to that API and with a Pokemon's name, and you get all of the information, the powers and the evolution and everything. You also have API for Open Library, which offers information about books, the authors, and all of the bibliographical data. Twitter also offers API. Facebook also offers API. You can use those APIs to create your own application, to write tweets, make a post on Facebook. So that's pretty convenient if you think about it. So for this project, we are of course going to utilize the NASA Open API. All you have to do is just Google NASA API, and that would be your NASA Open APIs. And this is the site. So for starters, all you have to do is fill out some details here, your name and email ID, and it will provide you with a key. Now it's a convenient way to manage, to track how much of the API a specific user is consuming. So that's the reason we have API keys in place for at least NASA API. So once you sign up, you get a string of key that you can utilize to consume the APIs. So if we come to browsing the APIs, you have different very interesting kinds of API. You have astronomy picture of the day. If you check that picture, this is how it comes, and this is the URL you want to hit. So if you want to make a request to this NASA API's database, all you have to do is use this URL along with the API key which comes in, and you'll get all of the parameters like this, the date, the start date, and these things. So this is an example. This is how it looks like. And you also, coming to the other APIs, you also have other APIs like the Earth polychromatic imaging camera. You also have API for Mars rover photos. Let's explore that. So you are going to get a lot of data, the kind of cameras, the kind of sols. I am able to recollect the sol word from The Martian. Yeah, it was pretty interesting movie. So you have pretty interesting data coming, which NASA is providing for free. So all you have to do is just write a piece of code and you're able to get that data. Now what you can do here is you just need to copy these URLs. You just need to make note of these URLs, and you of course have your API key. So the URLs must look something like this. That is the API URL, that is the API endpoint URL and the API key. So once you have that ready, you're good to go. Now to test this out, to test how the data is coming, what kind of variables are coming. So you can use this tool which is called Postman, and all you have to do is just copy paste your URL here. For example, if you wanna check the astronomical picture of the day, all you have to do is just copy that URL along with, so this is the URL, this is the API URL, and this is the key which was allotted to me. So if you make a GET request to that, you'll get this information in the form of JSON. Now JSON is a lightweight mode of communication. You can send out information through the key value pair. So this is what we have gotten. We have the copyright, of course, we have the date, we have the explanation in pretty detail. So this is the explanation, and you have the URL for the image. Now if you copy this URL and paste it in the browser, all you have to do is hit, and this is the image, this is the astronomical picture of the day. So as you can see, just using one URL which is offered by NASA, you can gather some pretty amazing information. Oh, that looks amazing. So this is what we are going to do on a programmatical level. The objective is to make API calls, receive the response and parse the response, and then display the response in a readable format through an HTML page. So this thing, utilizing API is often termed as consuming API. You're making API calls and you're consuming API. So you can make these calls using pretty much any programming language. You have Java, you have Python, C#, Angular, PHP, Ruby. You can even make these API calls using IoT devices, and you can also make the calls using Android apps. So basically Android apps, when they want to retrieve the data from any specific set of server, it's going to make a call and it's going to retrieve that data and display its output in the Android screen, maybe using Flutter or something. So that's how you consume the API. The way we are going to do it for this video, for this project, is using Spring Boot. So what basically is Spring Boot? So Spring Boot is basically Java open source framework. It is used to create microservices. Microservices themselves are the standalone individual set of services which are lightweight. That makes it pretty easy to develop production ready applications also. Now if you have a lot of data for any use case and you want to share that data through API endpoints, you can use Spring Boot to develop this API here, and the devices will communicate with this API and get the data, and the to and fro exchange of data goes through the Spring Boot application. So there are some pretty interesting surrounding dependencies you can utilize around Spring Boot, like Swagger. You have Thymeleaf. We are going to use Thymeleaf as the part of front end, as the part of displaying the outputs. So we'll discuss that when the section comes. For now, let's just understand that all we have to do is just make note of these URLs along with the API keys, have that ready, and then you're going to make API calls using the Spring Boot Java part. Then you're going to receive the response, and then you're going to display the response received through the Thymeleaf HTML template. So that's the workflow. So let's get into it, shall we? So this is a small project which I wrote. So let's just walk through the code overall, and what you can do here is, let's just consider the first file, which is the global constant file. Okay. So this is where I've stored all of the URLs which we are going to use. Now these are all the, this is the API URL, and again you have the key which was allotted to me when I signed up for it. So these are the URL variables. So that's sorted. And now what you also need to do is, you just make sure you're testing out these URLs through Postman first. So you get the idea of what kind of variables we are expecting, what kind of variables we need to define, the data type of it, and accordingly you can go ahead with the entity, with the model creation. Now what model here is, you have defined 5 different models here. Models basically stand like a template of sorts for the request we are making, like what kind of variables we would be receiving from NASA API. So I've pretty much defined those variables in this model class. So we have that, we have the APOD date. For example, let's just do one thing. This is the APOD, right? Let's just make apod as in the astronomical picture of the day. So if I'll just copy this thing and make a request to so this was already apod. So these are the variables which we are getting. So if you see the code here, defined as we have apod date, that is this is the date I'm trying to utilize, and then we have apod explanation. Again, we have the explanation for the picture, so that's also something which we are going to use. We have apod hd URL. Now this is the URL of the image, hd URL. So we also need the URL, of course, to display the image in our HTML page. So this is what we are going to use. So in the similar way, I have defined all of the variables which I'm going to use in this HTML, which I want to display through the HTML page. So accordingly, I've defined the classes for other API calls which we are going to make, like Mars rover camera information, Mars rover, the Mars rover information itself. We have the photos from Mars rover as well. So we have something called techport as well. So these are pretty much the same files. We have different sets of variables for the information which we are going to use. Now comes the part where we are going to make the API calls. Now here is the file. Now this is a specific function just for making the astronomical picture of the day API call. Now you have that specific, this is a specific set of Java functions you can use for, if you see, this is the very specific line where it's making the request, and I've used this variable here. If you see, this is coming from this. So this is the URL which that Java code hits, makes the request, and then it gets the response, and that response is being again stored in some way. So whenever this function, this is actually a function, this is not something which is calling it immediately. We have to call this function in another piece of code, and that is what we are going to get into once we are done with the function definition. And so this is so it is calling the API URL which is defined in the global constants, and then it is making HTTP GET request, and if the response is not null, it is going to parse through that response. So we are going to get a response something like this, right? So it has to parse through that response, it has to associate those variables to the model class which we have defined. So we have that model class here as well. So it is going to extract that date. For example, let's consider the date parameter which we are going to receive through API. So it is going to go through the response here. It is going to pick this date, and it is going to pick its value. It is going to store that value, which is a variable created for this model class, which is apod model class. So accordingly, I've made a request for all of the model classes, the API calls which we want to utilize. Again, the flow of operation, just to simplify it, it makes the HTTP call, it gets the response, it parses, it goes through the response, it picks the parameters which we have defined, and it is going to assign that value to the variable for the model class which we have created. And this model class is something which we are going to utilize in the front end part. So this is the typical flow of operation. So all of the API calls are pretty much the same, and we have also as an additional mechanism, if we fail to receive, for example, if the API key expires, or if the API URL changes, if we are not able to get the response from NASA API, it is going to throw an exception. It is going to show us an error that it has failed to receive the response, and then we can accordingly work on the resolution part. So that is an additional mechanism for catching the exceptions. So this is all about the API calls. Just as additional piece of information, we are making the request using HTTP. Now you also have certain other methods you can use. You have get method, you have post method, you have delete method, you have put method. Now NASA obviously won't be providing us access to change any information, neither do we want to. So for this project, we are just going to get the data. So we are going to make a get request. So that is what is happening here using this HTTP get request, and it's making that corresponding API call. So this is pretty much all about how we have defined functions to make API calls. Now comes the part of actually making the API call and then displaying that output in through HTML. So for that, like we discussed, like I mentioned earlier, we are going to use Thymeleaf. Now Thymeleaf is again an open source Java library which is basically HTML5 template based engine. This can be implemented on the server side. It's lightweight, it's easy to write. The syntax for Thymeleaf is pretty much similar to what HTML is, and it's also lightweight. There are not a lot of dependencies which have to be imported in a specific HTML page when it comes to Thymeleaf. So that's the reason it provides quick and full integration with Spring Boot. So we are going to use Thymeleaf to serve as the front end. Now comes the most important piece of code, that is the controller part. So this is where we are going to define the HTML page. So I have gone ahead and created a simple HTML page. So this is what it looks like. So we need to tell this piece of code where it needs, which HTML file it needs to refer. So this is the line where it is referring to a page called home, and this is what home HTML is. And after that, it is going to make that API call through this line of code, as simple as that. So we have defined the function, right? So if we go ahead and check this function, this is the function, and this is where the control will come, and it's going to make that API call. It's going to return a response, and that response is going to be stored here. Now we need to associate this response to the front-end HTML so that the information is being displayed. So this is what is going to do is we have those variables defined in the model class, right? It is going to use those variable names. We need to be careful that we are using the same variable names in the Thymeleaf template which we are using. So you can see this is where it's all defined. And we also have the Mars rover photos here. So you have that landing date or the photo, the Mars rover name, the camera, the URL for it. So, and you also have the variable for tech port. So this is the information which we have defined in the model class, and this is the information which we will be getting as the part of response when we are making calls to NASA API. And this is what we are going to display. So that's pretty much it for the Thymeleaf aspect. So we pretty much have everything in place. So for start, just to revise, we have the model class where we have defined the individual API calls, files and templates, where we have the specific set of variable names as well. And then comes the global constants, where we have defined the API calls, the URLs for API calls along with the API key. And then we have API calls functions, where it's just a piece of code where it's going to use where it's going to make calls using the using the URLs defined in the global constants, and it's going to return the response. And then finally we have the home controller. This is where we have defined the front end aspect of Thymeleaf. We have defined, we are making the call, we are calling that function which makes the API call. And then it's going to receive the response. It's going to associate that response to the HTML variables which we have defined through Thymeleaf syntax. So that's pretty much it. And finally, to make it run, to execute it, we need to specify which port on your local system it needs to run on. We can do that using the application properties. You just need to write the server.port, and this is the port I wish to run this application on. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the code walkthrough. Let's go ahead and run this application now. All you have to do is just right click and run as and Spring Boot app. So it's going to load. As you can see, it has started this application on the port 7701. Now all we have to do is just localhost. Here it is. So this is how the output looks like. It's we have defined a pretty simple HTML page, right? So it's not looking much fancy. We have the astronomical picture of the day, the title, the description, and the image, the URL. This is the image. We have Mars rover photos as well from different sources. Pretty interesting, pretty cool to look at. Wow, that's amazing. We also have the tech port information. So this is how. So So in a nutshell, we are able to get all of the data. We are able to display that data in through HTML. Now what I've done is I've just gone ahead and downloaded one of the fancy Bootstrap HTML template. You can do that as well. So for that, let's just stop this application and I'm going to rename the HTML files here because our code is expecting HTML file with the name home. So it's going to conflict here. So I'll just change the name here, and for the fancy HTML Bootstrap template, I'll just again go ahead and rename from that to home.html. Okay. Now what you can do here again is you can go ahead and run the application. So it has started. Let's go back to the browser. Let's just do a quick refresh. This is the information which we have. A little fancy looking. So the astronomical picture of the day, you have all of the information. The astronomical picture of the day itself, you can open it in the new tab and have a good glance. You can zoom. Pretty high resolution photo, I must say. Pretty cool things, NASA. Pretty cool actually. So this is again the Mars rover photos. It's pretty cool that NASA is actually offering this data, and it's pretty cool that you're able to retrieve that data through just a couple of lines of code, and you can use this data as you want to, and be it your Android application, be it a web application, be it anything. So that's how simple the exchange of data between such huge corporations and even common end users like us, that's how easy it has become these days. That's pretty much it, the tech port info and everything. So this is how you can utilize the API. So the intention behind this project was to get a little hands-on, revise some concepts of Spring Boot, and also have fun while doing so by picking up some interesting projects. So like I mentioned earlier, we have some pretty interesting APIs which we can use for free, and which we probably will in our next videos, hopefully. So I'll be sharing the link for this project, the GitHub link for this project in the description. You can go ahead and download it. You can try it out yourself as well. So yeah, that's all for this video. Do let me know how you felt about it. Is there anything interesting you learned, something new you learned? I think that would be amazing for me. So yeah, that's all for this one. I do hope to see you in the next one. Till we meet again. Cheers.